Okay, welcome to our next LEQ historical thinking skill, periodization. Let's talk about what is periodization. Periodization is the historical thinking that involves the ability to describe, analyze, and evaluate different ways that historians divide history into discrete and definable periods. And historians construct and debate different, sometimes competing models of periodization. The choice of specific turning points or starting and ending dates might accord a higher value to one narrative region or group than to another. And of course we have our historical periods. Period 1, beginning of time to 600 BCE. Period 2, 600 BCE to 600 CE. Period 3, 600 CE, 1450 to CE. Period 4, 1450 to 1750. Period 5, 1750 to 1900, and period 6, 1900 to the present. So when referring to periodization, these are the different periods that have been defined for AP World History. And what I was referring to when historians construct and debate these different models of periodization, this is what we're referring to. Why is period 1 considered complete at 600 BCE? What's the significance of 600 BCE? Just like for any of the other periods, period 3, why is it from 600 CE to 1450? What's the difference between that and 500 to 1500? So that's what periodization is. The argument and evidence used to should be framed around the application of this specific historical thinking skill, periodization. And it involves the ability to examine multiple pieces of evidence in concert with each other, noting contradictions, corroborations, and other relationships among sources to develop and support your argument. And I just want to go back here on what periodization is. It's important to understand that historical events and processes are organized into these discrete and definable historical periods, and evaluating whether a particular event or date could or could not be a turning point between these historical periods when considered in terms of particular historical evidence. And so that's a large part of periodization and defining what that means. Okay, and analyzing different or competing models of periodization. And that's something to keep in mind as you develop and support your historical argument for your long essay question. It should be a close analysis of relevant and diverse historical information and evidence, framing the argument and evidence around the application of this particular skill. Now, these periodization models are different amongst different textbooks and in different classes, and even amongst different historians. But you understand that you're given curricular materials and strategies to ensure that you can make connections across civilizations, regions, and even time periods. So you should really think of periodization as historical periods, right? Recognizing and accounting for the disparate, sometimes contradictory evidence from different sources, primary and secondary, that recognize the complexity of these processes that you're examining within these historical periods. Okay, so let's look at our themes again. These themes, remember, are present in all of the material and the content that we cover throughout the class. The development and transformation of social structures, state building, expansion, and conflict, that's your political. Interaction between humans and the environment, that's your intellectual. The development and interaction of cultures, and the creation, expansion, and interaction of economic systems. You should be able to apply many of these themes to any of the chapter content that we're learning about throughout the school year. And when you're trying to determine periodization and where something falls and why a period is over at a particular date and why another period begins at that date, some of the things you should consider: what are the specific dates or years chosen to begin and end the period? Why were these dates chosen? What are the common characteristics of a time period? as identified by historians. For example, the Renaissance or the Second Industrial Revolution, the Agricultural Revolution, and so forth. In order to identify significant patterns of continuity and change or periodization, because these are intricately linked, historians have to organize the past into these periods that share a set of common characteristics. And these periods begin and end with what historians consider turning points, or dates when a number of important and long-lasting changes are identified. 1350, 1450, or 1492. 1750, 1789, or 1800. Right? 1900 or 1914. All can be debated as turning points in world history, and periodization requires the identifying of the set of common characteristics that define that period and assessing the significance of the dates chosen to begin and end that period. So that's very important. Why did a source define a specific date as the beginning, but another source starts the period with another date? So that's significant to think about as well. For example, like I was talking about earlier when we looked at the historical periods, 600 to 1450 as opposed to 500 to 1450, or to 1500, excuse me. And recognizing those competing models of periodization and analyzing the reasons why is a significant skill that's required in AP World History. How would choosing a different beginning and end date change the story of what happened? Would it change the story of what happened? Right? If you changed a time period from 600 to 1450 to 500 to 1500, would that change the story? Would that change that period? So think about this. Which one of these essential questions would you find the most challenging to understand, and why? That's something that you should really think about, and always try to make your weaknesses your strengths. And as you develop these skills, you should use them, comparison, contextualization, causation, change in continuity over time, periodization, should all be used in tandem with the analyses of the historical evidence that's provided or that's known, and using that to develop and support your historical argument, your thesis. Now, as historians analyze primary sources, they recognize and account for disparate or sometimes contradictory evidence, and recognize the complexity of the process that you're examining, and need to organize the evidence from these historical sources in meaningful and persuasive ways to support a thesis that addresses one of these skills, whichever one you're given. And now the focus is on the periodization skill. And this ability to select and use the relevant historical evidence to support your argument can be one of the most challenging aspects of the skills of historical argumentation. For some, it might be periodization. For others, it might be CCOT. For some, it might be causation. For others, it might be comparison. It just depends. And the last thing that you should also consider is, and recognize that the major narratives and schema of periodization that's used by historians, or what's given to you in your textbook or even other books, may not apply to other disciplines. That's something that also needs to be kept in mind. It's not, it's not written in stone, and that's not the law. It could be very different depending on what's being studied. And the next thing is, developing an understanding of a specific historical event and reflecting on history as a broader conceptual study. The definition of depth refers to the ability to elaborate on concepts that have shaped the narrative of world history, such as the role of the environment, or on concepts that shape historical thinking, like periodization. And the conceptual understanding allows students, to apply that knowledge of the historical processes that you get through focusing on specific examples from your evidence. Okay, and so some of our skills that are associated with periodization, students should be proficient at examining ways historical events and processes can be organized into discrete, different, and definable historical periods, analyzing different and or competing models of periodization, and lastly, explaining whether a particular event or date could or could not be a turning point between different definable historical periods when considered in terms of particular historical evidence. So those are the skills that are necessary and are associated with periodization. Okay, the activity that you're going to get for periodization, I want you guys to work on that by yourselves, and please email me if you have any questions throughout the process. Good luck, and I will see you tomorrow.